Hi everyone, Kathleen Larmet here. Welcome to today's program on the top 10-ish things to know about uniform guidance. This webinar is being brought to you as part of your NCURA member benefits, and we're happy to have you with us. During today's program, you'll have the ability to ask questions via the question box on the right-hand side of your screen. Our speakers will answer questions throughout the program. However, due to the large size of today's audience, now over 800 of us, they may not have time to respond to all of your questions. So they will respond after the broadcast via email, and we will send them to everyone. So stay tuned for that. Let's meet our speakers now. Please welcome Tricia Callahan, Senior Research, Education, and Information Officer in the Office of Sponsored Programs at Colorado State University. Hi, Tricia.
Hi. Hello.
And Shannon Sutton, Director of Research Administration at Western Illinois University. Hi, Shannon.
Good afternoon.
Thanks for joining us today, and I'm going to turn this over now to Shannon.
Hey, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. So this webinar is an extension of a session that Tricia and I presented at the annual meeting in August. It's meant to provide a broad overview of what uniform guidance is, how it's organized, and how it is used by federal awarding agencies and awardees in managing funds. Tricia is here to provide somewhat of a pre-award perspective, while I am providing more of a post-award perspective. But as we all know, it flows from one to the other. We can't do one without the other. So at first, we're going to start with a poll to see who our audience is. So Maggie, can you launch that poll? There we go. So would you characterize yourself more as a pre-award person, a post-award person, or something else, possibly a compliance? And this is just to get a kind of a quick overview of who we've got out there watching with us today. All right. Just a couple more seconds. We'll let everybody vote real quick. I think everybody's getting on. Okay, so let's go ahead and close the poll. It looks like it's pretty well split. We have about 43% post-award, 31% pre-award, and 26% other. So welcome, everyone. I'm glad to see we've got a wide variety. So one of the first of the top 10 things we're going to talk about is just the uniform guidance in general. The uniform guidance was streamlined by the Office of Management and Budget. It took all of the circulars and put it into one document, and it was officially implemented back in December of 2014. Pieces of it were implemented since then, with the most recent going into effect this last July, or July of 2018. So the uniform guidance contains some wins for institutions of higher education and some more stringent rules. A good example of that is procurement, which we'll talk about later today. So the uniform guidance to the federal agency, once it is codified, it becomes agency regulations. The important point to remember throughout this entire broadcast today is that it is just that, it is guidance. And parts of it may be implemented differently by different agencies and programs within those agencies. So this is just the overall guidance from the federal government. For example, the uniform guidance states that non-federal entities without an F&A rate can negotiate a rate or use the 10% de minimis rate. However, National Institutes of Health, NIH, still uses the 8% de minimis rate for foreign entities. So again, just remember that as we go through, this is guidance.
Okay, Okay, so thanks for that, Shannon. Yeah, so it's guidance to the federal agencies. It used to be that we, as institutes of higher education, looked to some of the OMB circulars for our guidance. So for example, we looked at A21 when we were looking at cost principles applicable for institutions of higher education. Now we can look in section or subpart E of the uniform guidance. So it's really nice because it streamlined all those circulars into one guiding document. So we have this one-stop shopping place to go. Where we used to look at A110 for uniform administrative requirements, that information is now found in a couple different subparts of the uniform guidance, which we will go over in a moment in the next slide. Same thing for our audit requirements for states and local governments and nonprofit organizations. We can now look at subpart F of the uniform guidance. So it's really important to understand how those old circulars are now in one place, and then to understand where we find information that we used to look for prior in the former circulars. It's also important to remember that the agencies really differ on some of their interpretations and implementations of uniform guidance. So it's guidance to the federal agencies, right? The rules and solicitations and things that they have to follow. How agencies have chosen to implement uniform guidance could be different depending upon the agency type. It could be different depending upon the program type. So we always want to be going back to our agency regulations. We always want to be going back to our program regulations. And I know we'll talk a little bit more at the end about that order of precedence, but just to know that uniform guidance provides that one-stop shopping. It brings about that transparency and accountability all in one place, which is really, really helpful for us.
The other thing real quick I'm going to jump in, Tricia, is to know is if you come across people who are seasoned, like myself, and you find us referring to A21, you know where we're talking about, and that was the former uniform guidance.
Right. So we'll move forward then to the next slide and show some of these subparts now. So this is the organization of the uniform guidance, and it's really nice to have things in one place. It's nice now that acronyms and definitions for different items are in one place. There's less of a chance now that there's differing definitions, say, between the different circulars, because it's all in one place, which is really nice. I use this acronyms and definitions, the first subpart A, quite frequently in the work I do. Subpart B has the general provision. So this is really the purpose of the uniform guidance, the applicability, and as we've mentioned, it's applicable to the federal awarding agencies and also to us as awardees. It also talks about how often the content of uniform guidance needs to be reviewed, which is every 5 years. So know that it's not just one and done. We're constantly looking at this and providing input, and every 5 years there could be changes to uniform guidance. So make sure that you are always working from a current copy, right? Also, general provision section talks a little bit about some of the mandated disclosures that we have to make as institutes of higher education or as awardees to the federal awarding agencies. Okay. Then we have pre and post award requirements. We did the survey at the beginning to find out who's pre, who's post, who might be sitting on both sides, or maybe in a different area like compliance. Because it's important that we know there are requirements, pre and post award requirements for the federal award agencies in uniform guidance. So we need to be cognizant of this information no matter where we sit in that life cycle. So the pre-award federal requirements, there's discussion there of the different award types, such as assistance mechanisms, your grants and cooperative agreements versus contracts. There's also discussion there on when we should use fixed amount awards, information about what goes into a funding opportunity announcement, what has to be in there. So again, guidance to those federal agencies, what they have to let us know, and how long they have to put the information out there before a deadline. So all of that is written into uniform guidance, and there's even information in subpart C on the merit review process. Then we move over to some of the post-award requirements. Here we're talking internal controls and procurement standards, some of the things that you're going to talk about a little bit more later on in the webinar. Also some of the project closeout requirements. So if you have post-award area questions that you're looking at, you can't find guidance under your federal regulations or in your federal award document, you might go back here and take a look. Subpart E, these are our cost principles, so reasonableness, allocation of costs, methods of allocation. And what's really interesting with uniform guidance is they didn't come out and say, here's the method that you have to use for allocation. Instead, they said our institutions have to have documented methods of allocation and that we have to follow those methods. So uniform guidance isn't really prescribing to us all the ways that we have to do things. Instead, it's making us accountable. And Shannon, I think you'll talk a little bit more about that when you talk about internal controls. Okay. Also,
Yes.
audit requirements. When we used to look at a former circular, now the audit requirements are all right there under subpart F. And then there are quite a number of appendices. I think there are at least 11 appendices now. And if you're not an institution of higher education, maybe you're a nonprofit, there might be information in those appendices that are pertinent to you. So the reason why we went through this, one is to see where the former guidance now is in uniform guidance, but I think more importantly, to understand where you are in uniform guidance. So first, make sure that you're looking at an updated copy of uniform guidance if anything has changed, and then to really know how to use it and know where you're looking. So I've done some workshops here on campus where we actually do a little scavenger hunt. And it's interesting because if you ask somebody to look for participant support costs, like the definition of, and somebody is on the computer and just electronically typing in participant support, you're going to get 16 different references in uniform guidance on participant support. You'll have the definition there in subpart A, which is what the question was asking, or you might have information about prior written approval needed for participant support and some of the cost principles, which are actually in subpart E. Then there's actually information also in the appendix, which applies to nonprofit organizations. So if you're not a nonprofit, you don't want to be in that area looking up information. So be cautious when you're looking at uniform guidance. We're going to repeat over and over. One, always look at your award documents, look at your federal awarding guidance. If you don't see things there, go back to uniform guidance and then make sure you're in the right place looking for the correct information. That's all. So I'll let you say a little more on internal controls.
Yep. As Tricia mentioned, subpart D includes some internal controls, and it's mentioned in subpart D 200.303, but internal controls are mentioned over 100 times in the new uniform guidance. I think they wanted to make sure we were aware that they were looking at internal controls and they were an integral part of the process. So right now we'd like to see what your definition or an example of an internal control at your institution might be. Please use the question box and you can put your answers in there. So again, what is an example of an internal control at your institution, or what is your definition of internal controls? Okay. I'm waiting for some people to type. In the meantime, the overall definition is that internal controls are safeguards to assure accuracy, validity, and reliability of financial, management, program, and other information. So some of the examples that have popped up of internal controls is separation of duty, effort reporting, faculty effort certification, safeguarding assets, separate approvals, individuals, working on different parts of the process, internal checklists. There's great things, reconciliation sheets, wonderful examples flowing in here. Inserting institutional policies. So yeah, I think everybody's got a great idea of what internal controls overall are. For us at Western Illinois University, our post-award area includes financial post-award. So some of the internal controls that we have in place here is our grant and contract administrators approve expenses on the grant, but then those are routed to our business services area, and then they approve them and audit them to make sure that they're in adherence with both institutional and state guidelines, since we're a state institution. So another example of internal controls and goes to the separation of duty is the grant and contract administrators prepare invoices, yet the payments are received and logged down in our business services area. So there's a separation between the billing and the receiving of the cash. Tricia, what's an example of internal control at Colorado State?
So for our institution, we really promote the use of our quality system for preparing budgets, because we have institutional based salaries in there. We have our current fringe rates, our current negotiated F&A, and that way that's just a double check that we're using right salaries, that we're using correct fringes, correct F&A. So that's one example of internal control at our institution. So, and I will say, Shannon, somebody had asked that we repeat the definition. Would you mind repeating that definition of internal control?
Oh, certainly. So it's safeguards to assure accuracy, validity, and reliability of financial, management, program, and other information. So that's kind of the overall. Go ahead, sorry.
Oh, go ahead. Yep. I was going to just say that some people have also asked that we share slides, and we can certainly do that. And we actually have a little one-pager that really kind of expounds upon all of these areas that we can certainly share after the webinar as well.
Definitely. So again, within the uniform guidance, it says we must establish and maintain effective internal controls over the federal award. Some of the things that are required of all systems is that we comply with federal regulations and the award agency terms and conditions. We evaluate our compliance with regulations and award terms and conditions. You take prompt actions when instances of non-compliance are identified, including those that are found in audit findings. And you use reasonable measure to safeguard protected personally identifiable information and information designated as sensitive. So make sure that you keep those safeguarded. One of the other key things I'd like to point out throughout the uniform guidance is the word should and must. Where you see must in the uniform guidance, that is a must. You must do. There's no questions asked. If you see the word should indicates best practices. So it's something you should do, but it's not a firm requirement. The next area of the top 10 uniform guidance is F&A cost recovery for subrecipients. The new uniform guidance says that you must flow down all the terms and conditions, and you must honor the subrecipient's rate where they have a formal rate. If the subrecipient does not have a formal rate and they have never applied for a formal federally negotiated indirect cost rate, then you can use a 10% de minimis rate. The third option would to be used a agreed upon rate between the two parties. So your three options with subrecipients are to honor their federally negotiated indirect cost rate. If they've never had one, they can apply the 10% de minimis rate, or the two parties can do an agreed upon rate. The other thing that changed with F&A is that now you can apply for a one-time 4-year extension of the rate. Some universities used that when it first came out, and others are still waiting, but that is another area that was changed with the new uniform guidance.
Okay, something else that changed with uniform guidance is they really called out conducting a risk assessment on our subawardees. So to kind of parallel what you were talking about with our subawardees, we now are responsible for subaward monitoring. I think we've always been responsible as subaward monitoring, but uniform guidance made it very clear. So pass-through entities are required to evaluate subrecipient risk and then determine the appropriate amount of monitoring activities based on our risk assessment. It's really encouraged that we do this at the proposal stage. A lot of institutions might wait, though, to see if an award's going to be made, and might wait until that award stage. But it's not required, but recommended we do this at the proposal stage. So pass-through entities are required to obtain audit reports on our subrecipients from the Federal Audit Clearinghouse. A lot of us, I think, will just request them from our subrecipients, but we're really supposed to be doing our due diligence and getting those from the clearinghouse, and then following up if there are any findings. It's not enough to just request these, but if there are findings on those audit reports, we don't just tuck that away and say, okay, well, we got the report. So at my institution, we actually have a staff person who does all of our subrecipient risk assessment and monitoring. And then we've laid out guidelines at our institution of what constitutes for our institution what we consider a high risk sub. So you can also find audit information under FDP, the Federal Demonstration Partnership. The Federal Demonstration Partnership is a partnership between the federal awarding agencies and institutes of higher education. You don't have to be an FDP member to access a lot of the information that's out there on their website and to access this audit information. So I'm going to have a definition here of what a subrecipient is for those who are very new. So our next slide here will show that definition and what is even the point of the subaward. If you have an entity that's going to be carrying out a portion of your award, then you have to enter into this relationship. And it's really important at that pre-award stage that we make that identification, that we are determining if we are going to send funds to a subrecipient or if they need to be classified, say, as a vendor or contractor. So we've really tried to do our due diligence at the pre-award stage. It makes things a lot easier. It also might impact our budgeting. If you are on a modified total direct cost F&A calculation, that calculation will be impacted by whether you have subawards versus contractors. So the more we can do up front, the better. So the next slide actually shows information right out of uniform guidance that pass-through entities, that's us, right, must make that case-by-case determination of whether the party receiving the funds is a subrecipient or contractor. And there are some really good tools out there that universities have, kind of a checklist for determination. Sometimes it's very easy and clear to make that determination. Other times it's not, and we have to ask a lot of questions, that's our life, right? It depends. And when we get back that questionnaire and there are as many checks on the sub-recipient side as there are on the contractor side, that's when we know we have to have a conversation with our PI about the scope of work that's being done and the nature of the entity that's doing that work. So that information comes out of 331 in uniform guidance, and following that uniform guidance in point 332 says that there are specific elements that must be included in our subaward. So we need to make sure anybody at our institution that's issuing subawards that we are collecting that information and we have that information. And then back to our pre-award folks, uniform guidance goes on to say that prior written agency approval is needed to issue a subaward. So if we didn't include and didn't categorize an entity as a subaward at the proposal stage, at award time, we're going to have to go back to the federal agency and get that written approval. If we had it in our budget and had it in our budget justification, that constitutes that prior written approval. So that's where uniform guidance is not just for post awarders, really, it's for pre and post alike. And then finally, the last point that I pulled out of uniform guidance was that all subrecipients of federally funded award, or all recipients of, must be registered in the system for award management. And likely you have somebody at your institution that is responsible for making sure your institution maintains that registration. So is there anything you'd like to add or any questions that came in on that?
There's a couple of questions that came in. The last one questioned that if something is over 25,000, should it be a subaward? And I don't think that there's necessarily a dollar limit for a subaward. It depends on the nature of the agreement. If the other party is doing part of the work and part of the grant, they should be classified as a subaward regardless of the dollar amount.
Right. The only time that threshold comes in is if you're on a modified total direct cost basis for your F&A calculation. It has nothing to do with the determination of whether somebody should be a subaward versus a contractor. It's more of how you do that calculation, because we can only collect on the first 25,000 of any subaward. So if that subaward's 5,000 in the first year, you collect full and direct. If it's 5,000 in the next year, until you reach that $25,000 threshold for each individual sub. So maybe that's where that confusion on the 25,000 came in, but it doesn't have anything to do with making the determination. Okay. Other questions there? I think something came on about audits, and I think we might be answering that later. So let's hold off on that one, and we'll move forward then to effort reporting. Okay, effort reporting. So when uniform guidance came out, I know folks at my institution were like, oh, we'll have to do effort reporting. It's not in uniform guidance. Well, it is in uniform guidance. It's under compensation personnel services 200.430. So it's something that we use the term time and effort reporting at our institutions. Uniform guidance uses compensation and personal services. Again, uniform guidance didn't prescribe to institutions how they had to do this. Instead, it said that you have to have a means of verifying charges or cost share on sponsored projects. So we have to have a mean of confirming that any salaries charged to a sponsored project is related to the work, and it goes on to talk about expressing it in the percent of total institutional effort. So there is still information on effort reporting. Uniform guidance just doesn't dictate how we have to do it at our institution, whether it's paper and pencil and you're sending around the verification and having the investigator sign off, whether you use a system to do that, whether you use payroll certification. That's not mandated. What's mandated is that we have an auditable system of record and that we're doing this. Because the feds want to make sure that if we are putting cost on awards, that those costs are related to the award. And that's the way that we can verify that. So are there questions that came in on that, or anything else you'd like to add on compensation reporting? Okay, if not, we can move forward to participant support costs.
So participant support costs are another area that's kind of gray and has garnered a lot of attention lately. So the uniform guidance describes participant support costs as, can we go ahead and show the big definition? Direct costs for items such as stipends and allowances, travel allowances, and registration fees paid to or on behalf of participants or trainees, but not employees, in conjunction with conferences or training. So when we talk about participant support costs and we talk about the allowable activities, we'll go back one slide to see the overall matrix. Thank you. We can see that different activities are included for participants are meetings, workshops, conferences, seminars, and other training activities. Eligible participants includes students and teachers, private sector reps, agency reps, and others. So allowable costs are stipends for non-compensated participation. That is a key area. A student cannot be an employee and paid on the grant and also be classified as a participant. So it's stipends for non-compensated participation. They can receive travel support, they can receive meals and other participation related activities. All participant support costs must be specified, itemized, and justified in the budget justification. An indirect cost is not allowable on participant support costs. Oftentimes you do have to keep participant support costs either in a separate category or at our institution we keep them actually in a separate sub-account because they need to be accounted for differently than the rest of the organization or the rest of the expenses on the grants themselves. So we're going to do a little quiz here. So which of the following is participant under the definition of participant support costs? It'd be a conference, the choices are conference speaker, human subjects incentive payment, an undergraduate student conducting summer field work and paid off of the grant, or an undergraduate student taking part in an NSF Research Experience for Undergraduates, or RAU grant. So we've got the votes coming in. And right now it looks like the majority of the people who have voted so far do state that the participant definition would be the student on an NSF Research Experience for Undergraduate program, and that would be correct. The conference speaker, while conference costs are allowable, the conference speaker is not a participant support cost. The conference speaker would be an actual cost of the grant. A human subjects incentive payment, if you're doing research with human subjects, that's where a gray area comes in, not gray or confusing area comes in, because sometimes those are called participants because they're participants in the human subjects research, but that does not make them a participant in this definition. So just making sure that we keep those two separate as you're trying to look at different participant support costs and how to budget them and how to make sure they're properly classified at your institution. So the undergraduate student conducting summer field work paid off the grant. The problem with that one is they cannot be compensated partially as an employee and as a participant on the same grant. So that is why then we come down to the final answer, number D, or letter D, that it would be somewhat a student working on the REU program. And the REU program is aimed at developing the student's research skills and providing high quality mentoring experience. And based on that role, that's why the National Science Foundation, NSF, has determined that the REU student would be considered a participant.
So Shannon, a couple of questions have come in about participant support costs. One person is just reminding us and reiterating that participant support costs do not have indirect cost charge for MTDC, but may be included for an IDC cost.
Okay.
The other thing is that somebody asked the question, I think that we always get into these it depends cases. What if the speaker is also a participant, right? And in that case, you know, you don't want to give them their speaker stipend as participant support. That would be outside. You would want to budget that separately. But if then they're going to turn around and be a participant and they have travel and meal allowances and things that you've given to other participants, then you certainly would want to budget that portion under participant support, making clear in any of your documentation how you split that up. So I'm trying to think if there's anything else. I think somebody had a question about from foreign countries as well, if the participant's from a foreign country. So does a special consideration need to be given from participants from foreign countries?
Not that I'm aware of, as long as I still meet the definition of a participant.
Correct.
And that you would have participant support costs.
Right, right. Okay. And then a final question here. Can you clarify why the human subject is not a participant support cost, especially where subjects are not associated with the institution? So, and that's been a tricky one. And I think that some of the hang up there is the language that we use on those human participants, because we call them human participants because they are volunteers. They have to give consent to participate in the research, okay? But they're not really contributing they're contributing to the science as far as just, you know, being surveyed or whatever their role is, but they're not really learning from it the way a participant would learn from, right? A participant comes as a learning educational type of experience. So I think it's kind of hard then to make that clarification. At my institution, we've tried to go away from using human participants and saying human incentives to incentivize their coming to our studies, enrolling in our studies, but again, they're not really getting that same educational benefit out of it as, say, a teacher would if they're coming to a conference that's just for teacher education. So really think about kind of the benefit that the person is getting from it. If they're getting benefit from it, they're probably a participant. Whereas if their only benefit is they're getting compensated for their time and for their enrollment, then that's not the same.
Thank you. That's a very good definition. All right. And next we'll move on to our favorite, I laugh, is procurement. What you do see on your slide, I have to give credit to Gil Tran, who is the director of the Office of Management and Budget. This is his bear claw that he first put out when the uniform guidance was proposed, and it has been out there since then. I find it a very great, I can't think of the word, illustration of the uniform guidance in a nutshell. So, our procurement with the uniform guidance. So this was one of the biggest areas of change for institutions of higher education that came through with the new uniform guidance. Procurement became much more stringent and delineated than it was in the prior circulars. The final uniform guidance for procurement for institutions of higher education just went into effect July 1st of 2018. So for most of us, for the last fiscal year we just completed. So non-federal entities, which would be universities, receiving federal awards must have documented procurement procedures that reflect the federal law, the uniform guidance standards, and state regulations if required. The key word there is documented. You need to make sure that the procurement with regards to federal funds is documented. With the different levels, so micro purchases were not in the original draft document, and that brought a lot of heartache to universities when it first came out, what we would have to document for any purchases. And the level of threshold was raised from $3,500 to $10,000, and that helped significantly with the final guidance. So for micro purchases, where the purchases does not exceed $10,000, you just need to be practical, and you need to distribute these purchases equitably among qualified suppliers. No competitive quotes are required with micro purchases. When you move to the small purchase, this is your purchases between $10,000 and $250,000, which is the simplifies acquisition threshold. For the small purchases, price and rate quotes must be obtained from an adequate number of sources. Again, adequate is not defined in the uniform guidance, so you would go back to your institution's policy of what is determined to be adequate. No cost or price analysis is required for small purchases. The next level is level 3, sealed bids, and those would be for purchases over the simplified acquisition threshold, which is $250,000. And that requires formal solicitation, and the fixed price is awarded to the bidder who conform to all the materials terms and is the lowest price. A sealed bid is a formal process, primarily used for construction projects. Competitive proposals have the same threshold, anything over $250,000, requiring formal solicitation. These are usually fixed price or cost reimbursable purchase orders, and they're used when sealed bids are not appropriate. There's usually a predetermined evaluation method to make similar to a rubric from an adequate number of sources. And the last one is sole source, a non-competitive proposal. This is appropriate only when specific criteria are met. There's only availability from one source, it's a matter of public emergency, the federal agency authorizes it, or etc. This must be highly documented, because by using the sole source justification, you are basically overruling all the other 4 paws that are out there. So overall with procurement, any purchase needs to make sure it meets the 5 requirements. It complies with your documented procurement procedures. It is necessary to carry out the award. It is made with open competition to the extent required. It's in compliance with your own conflict of interest policy at your institution. And the documentation contains sufficient and proper history of the purchase. So you'll make sure if cost and price analysis is required, that that is documented and in the file, and the vendor selection and how you came to select that vendor for that purchase. So again, the key here is documentation. You will be audited against what your university has in your policies and procedures, and you want to make sure that you've got the proper documentation, that you're following all of those.
And Shannon, a question came in asking when the micro purchase threshold changed.
It changed with the latest implementation that went in effect July 1st, 2018.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to move on then to administrative salaries and computing. I want to acknowledge that there were still a lot of questions coming in on participant support costs, which isn't actually surprising. So before uniform guidance, there really wasn't a definition out there in the circulars for participant support costs. We all looked to the National Science Foundation, which is one of the federal agencies that was really a leader in defining participant support costs. And it was really nice when uniform guidance came out and actually defined it, and that they used the definition almost verbatim from the NSF. And I will say the NSF is still really in the forefront on providing some guidance and providing examples of when somebody isn't a participant or when somebody is. And if you go out to whatever browser you use, Google, whatever search mechanism that you use, and look for the NSF May 2017 newsletter on participant support costs. They define participant support costs, which again is very similar to the definition that is in uniform guidance, and they have a lot of frequently asked questions in that newsletter. A lot of the questions that you all have asked us on here about meals, if meals are provided at the conference, can we include those? Students, if somebody's a student here and they're paid as a student employee, can we then also put them on an RU program? You can find that guidance there. Caution that this is NSF's guidance and interpretation, and to always make sure you understand, if you're working with a different federal agency, their interpretation. And I always say, if you have a question, ask, right? Call up the grants management office and find out, what their interpretation is, and then make sure that you document and follow up why you included something as a participant support cost. So it's something that we grapple with. I know the last time that Jean Feldman gave a webinar, she said, here we are once again with participant support, because the questions keep rolling in about it, and it's not always easy to make the determination. And it's not always easy when we have students paid as student employees, and then all of a sudden they're also going to maybe participate in a sponsored activity like the REU program from NSF. So take a look at that guidance, and the information I said we'd send out after, we've referred to some of that guidance as well. So, okay, on then to administrative salaries and computing devices. So for some of us, when we saw uniform guidance came out, we thought really nothing's changed here. Other institutions felt very different. So the former rules and regulations didn't say we absolutely could not charge administrative salaries or computing devices. It actually said we had to make a case-by-case basis, and we had to justify, we had to make sure then we weren't double dipping with our F&A. I think what happened with uniform guidance is they really clarified the circumstances under which administrative salaries and computing devices could be charged. So at my former institution, we charged them before uniform guidance, but we had very good justification and reasoning for doing so. So for example, we had a center there that every other summer hosted a conference in DC, and we organized all the travel for folks to go there, and there was really a lot of administrative burden. And because of that, one of the administrative assistants in that center actually was put on the grant to handle that, all the travel arrangements that she had to handle every other summer. And we justified that, and the NSF approved it. Another way, if we were maybe a little bit more risk averse, like some of our counterpart institutions who said, absolutely not, can you ever charge administrative salaries or computing devices? One thing we could have done, and it was actually a suggestion we made for future years, was to engage a travel agent and to pay for the travel agent on the grant rather than putting the administrative time on there, because then you also have to have that due diligence of making sure then that time wasn't in your base for calculating your F&A rate, so that way you're not double dipping. So I think uniform guidance was really good about clarifying those circumstances and saying that in both cases, when you're talking about administrative salaries or computing devices, that they really have to be key or integral to the project, right? That we have to specifically include them in the budget and justify them. And also we have to have a method for ensuring that we're not recovering those as indirect cost, right? If we're already direct charging those to the grant. So, and again, uniform guidance didn't say exactly how you had to do this. They're not telling us how we have to do it. They're saying you have to do it, and you have to have that system in place. And if they come in and ask questions, we have to be able to verify that no, we didn't put somebody on a grant as a direct charge, and also then include them in our indirect cost calculation. So I think just some clarification there. No real big change, but maybe for some institutions that were a little bit more risk averse, it may have made them a little less so. I'm not sure. I wasn't at one of those institutions. So. Okay. And then we'll move on then to order of precedence.
All right, and this takes us back to the first point that we made today, that the uniform guidance is guidance to the federal agencies. Some agencies and program interpretations may vary and that they can apply, but you always follow the agency and the program guidelines. So if you look at this triangle, if you start at the bottom in the order of precedence, you have what we're talking about, the federal policies, your uniform guidance, your 2 CFR 200. Above that, usually more specific, would be your sponsor specific terms and conditions and the research terms and conditions if they're applicable. The program announcement then could trump both the sponsor terms and conditions and the uniform guidance. And at the very top of the triangle, you have the award terms. So you need to look at all of these areas before you can determine if a cost is actually allowable on a grant. An example to kind of go through this whole process is alcohol. So if you look in the uniform guidance under allowability of costs, alcohol is a no. Alcohol is not allowed on grants. So you go, okay, then you move up to the next level to the sponsor's terms and conditions. And let's say the sponsor says no, alcohol is not allowed. The agency says no, the program says maybe. And then you get up to the actual awards terms and conditions. And let's say that the award is to study the effects of alcohol on rats. Therefore, alcohol would be allowable. So if you look at the total triangle, you can see that while it may not be allowed at certain levels, it can be allowed at others. But you want to make sure that you go from the bottom to the top. So conversely, if something is allowable for the uniform guidance, but the agency terms say it's not allowable, then in that grant, it is definitely not allowable per the agency terms. You also have to look at the public laws and if you have university or state guidelines that you have to follow. So something may be allowable for federal guidelines, but if it's not allowable by your state, you need to be consistent, and then it may not be allowable on the grant. NCURA has a YouTube channel. It's NCURA 1959. And Ann Holmes has a video out there on this, and it's a great, quick little video. It is back on the A circulars instead of the uniform guidance. However, it's a great video to show your staff and your PIs if there's questions on order of precedence. And so we're getting close to the top of the hour. And so this does wrap up the formal presentation on the top 10-ish things you need to know about the uniform guidance. So we've been trying to answer questions as they've come in. If you've got other questions, go ahead and send them in now, and we'll try to answer them in the time that we have allotted.
I like this last one. Can award terms be less restrictive than uniform guidance? I don't know that I've seen award terms be less restrictive, but even if they were, you want to follow the most restrictive. Sometimes those are our state laws or our institutional policies, and we need to definitely be following those, even if the federal award says we can do something. If we can't do it according to state law, if we can't do it according to institutional policy, then we shouldn't be doing it.
We did have a question earlier, and I just want to make sure that I'll answer it. I believe I'm on the right track. It was way back. It said, if a sponsor does not allow F&A on or indirect cost on the prime award, can a sub include it? Can the sub include F&A on their sub award? And the answer is no, because if it's not allowed for you at the federal level, you would flow those terms and conditions down to the sub, and it would not be allowable at that level either.
Right. Not allowed is not allowed. And take that into consideration also when you're doing cost sharing. So if an item is not allowed on a grant, but the award requires cost share, oftentimes you cannot include that item also as cost share because unallowable is unallowable. It's the same thing. And we cannot flow down to our subs unallowable cost. I want to go back then to your example, Shannon, with alcohol. Somebody said they asked because you gave an example about alcohol. Uniform guidance says no alcohol. Remember, this is guidance. Remember, it forms that baseline and that certain programs then may then allow something. So maybe that's a case about that, you know, what's restrictive and what's not restrictive, right? In that case, very specifically, when the program said that alcohol was allowed, then yes, it's allowed as long as that's something that your institution allows, or again, state law. I'm in a state where a lot of hemp research goes on. That's allowed in my state, that's allowed at my institution. Even though the award might say it's allowed, it still might not be allowed in your state or your institution. So we get into those it depends questions. So with the case of alcohol, as long as it's okay with your state and your institution, that is one case where that less stringent maybe comes in, where the program then and the award terms and conditions would trump that general uniform guidance. So I hope that helps clarify that question.
Tricia, someone asked about our thoughts on electronic record keeping versus paper. In the event of an audit, are electronic receipts okay?
We actually just had a great big meeting on this. Right before I got on here, there are over 100 research administrators here at CSU, and one thing we talked about was record retention. We do allow, instead of original receipts, we allow those scanned copies that are kept in our electronic systems. So we just want to make sure as we're putting things in, that scanning things in, that we have all the materials associated with an award under that given award, and then we want to make sure that we're following those record retention policies with those electronic documents. Not that electronic documents really ever go away. Even if you hit delete, there's probably a way to get that information back, which is a whole different conversation. But we are actually working to become a paperless campus. So many of our departments, including our Central Sponsor Programs Office, have put in systems so that we can store all the receipts and all the things that we need, all that financial information in electronic form. We just need to make sure that we're following federal and state record retention policies as we do that. But we have gotten rid of literally truckloads of paper, and now it's all gone to, of course, secure, backed up storage sites. So hopefully that answers that question. We're going to just take the last couple minutes here and look through the questions to see what else we have time to answer.
There is one that talks about, does uniform guidance dictate how effort is distributed either on a calendar year basis or academic summer? It does not dictate it. You can do effort reporting monthly, quarterly, semi-annually, annually. Just have it documented and consistent throughout the process at your institution. Effort reporting is kind of another tough one, along with participant support costs.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of guidance on it.
And then one of the questions, again, related to that record retention is, would you still need to print out the papers? We actually have had auditors in recently, agency audit and state auditors, and we actually just showed them our electronic documents, and they did not request the paper. So I think as long as you, again, have that record that you can show them. We make sure as we are scanning things in, we have two things that we make sure of. One, they're in a PDF format that's readable, because sometimes you might put in something in some type of, like, let's say, I'm going to go back to old days, WordPerfect, that nobody can open. If you put the document in, it was a WordPerfect document, nobody can open it now, that's not useful. So we make sure that all of our documentation, even email communication that might need to go into the file, is put into PDF. We also make sure we have our who, what, when, where, and why documented as well. So that way if questions come up, that we have it written down and documented.
Do you see any other questions coming in, Tricia?
There's one about a university not having clear guidance on allowable versus unallowable, about a farewell party to charge alcohol. Okay, so that's different than having alcohol for research. Usually that's a no. Going back to that question, does this benefit the award? The PI and people partying may think it benefits the award, but if it's not being used for the research, no. So I think you're probably safe in saying no to that charge.
I would agree.
Okay. And then, does your institution require document business purpose for all transactions? I'm not sure about that, the question. Document business purpose. I mean, for any financial trans. Oh, go ahead, please.
I would think you have to say, how does that relate to the grant, or if it's a purchase that isn't apparent on the front, how does it relate to the grant, and is there a business purpose for that purchase?
Right. Okay. Another, are memberships allowed as a direct charge? And I had a colleague recently ask, how can I not say it depends to every question? But we live in a world that it depends, right? If a membership is required for maybe a survey that they're doing on a certain site, then it could be allowable. Again, does it benefit the project? Could you, if you have to have that membership to actually go and conduct the research or to get the data, then maybe it is allowable. It's something that you would have wanted to put into your budget justification, and that you would have wanted to have a good justification on, and then to make sure there was nothing called out in your award terms and conditions that said, by the way, we're considering that membership unallowable. So it's always a matter of having to ask the questions and having proper documented justifications.
Definitely. And as we see some other questions come in, another place to ask questions is, NCURA has the Collaborate sites on its website, and you can post those questions there and get advice and information from your esteemed colleagues there also. So at this point, Trish and I would like to thank you for participating in this webinar, and I'd like to turn it back over to NCURA's Executive Director, Kathleen Larmet.
Well, and I'd like to offer our thanks to Shannon Sutton and Tricia Callahan for sharing their top 10-ish things to know about uniform guidance